believe this breakfast croissant is only $1.99?
Good morning, everyone. As folks are coming in, we'll get started here in just a couple of moments. Michelle, we'll probably be able to go ahead and get started here soon. This is live streaming through the church's YouTube channel, right? Yeah, as well. So we might not see all the participants here, as there might be there as well. So I'll kick it off to you, Michelle.
All righty. Thank you so very much. I am excited to be a part of this forum. I was introduced to Humansave when I emceed a program for the Women's Business Council, the Long Beach Chamber of Commerce, and I was extremely impressed by one of the participants, who is our speaker today. I was especially impressed by the fact that she brought awareness to something that most of us in the room thought only existed in other places. Like, we did not believe that it existed here in our city. We never even thought for a second that it was something that we could be a part of, or that we could participate in. It's wonderful to note that this organization, Humansave, is addressing the mental health issues that are brought on by being exploited and human trafficking and commercial child sexual exploitation. So I want to introduce to each of you the Executive Director of Humansave, and Francesca Douglass-Franco. Please take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me on here, and most importantly, for caring enough about this very difficult subject to ask for a presentation at all. I think human trafficking has been coined modern slavery that stays hidden in plain sight, because it's something that once you recognize the signs, hopefully you'll realize just how prevalent it is, and wonder afterwards how it was that we didn't already know about this sooner. And you're definitely not alone. I think most places that I present to, be it businesses in Long Beach or beyond, even with very compassionate, caring individuals, just don't know that this is happening here. So thank you so much for that warm welcome, Michelle. It was such a pleasure meeting you at that time, and I remember being so awestruck by you and your ability to make anyone feel at ease, including me. And I was really nervous that night, so thank you for that. So without further ado, let me just tell you a little bit more about Humansave. We do primarily work with human trafficking survivors and child sex trafficking survivors. We provide therapy services to victims as young as 2 years old. And one thing that is a bit unique about us is that we do try to treat the whole family system rather than just the one individual, because we do realize that the things that make one member of the family vulnerable tend to make the others vulnerable as well. And because it's really important to know that you're taking this one person out, you're providing them with therapy and all these tools, but then you're shoving them right back in the place that they were when they became vulnerable in the first place. So really the whole system needs to change in order for the healing to really, really take root. We also provide awareness and prevention programs, much like this one, to Long Beach Unified School District. We've worked with several middle schools and high schools in the area, and something that is both rewarding and heartbreaking is that oftentimes after the very first training, the teachers, whether it's a school that would be deemed at risk or one of the more prestigious schools, usually says that they know somebody, a student, a previous student, or even a current student in a different class that was being sexually exploited. They just didn't realize that that's what it was. And then especially prevalent in the more at-risk or high-risk areas is the kids are just not surprised at all by anything that I have to say. And in fact, they're the ones educating me on what's going on and how they're getting recruited online and the new tactics that these predators are employing to lure more children into this place. So I don't know if I can screen share or whether it's necessary, but I would if you guys don't mind, like for you to interact every now and then, that would be awesome. And I did see that you just allowed me to screen share, so thank you for that. Here we go. And everybody can still see everybody else, right? Or is that?
We're working on that to see. Yep.
I can just not. I mean, it's up
Nope,
to you.
we can see everybody now. It's all good.
Okay, awesome. And then you can see the presentation and not my other screen, right? Cool. All right, so what is human trafficking? You guys may have heard of it already. Does anybody want to venture a guess, or perhaps you already know? Anyone? Nope, that's okay. So the federal definition here is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by improper means, namely force, abduction, fraud, or coercion for an improper purpose, including forced labor or sexual exploitation. This is true for any adult, but what has recently changed, and this is a good thing, probably in 2016, is that any child, so anyone under 18 involved in commercial sex by federal law is a victim of trafficking. Beforehand, these kids, 12-year-olds, 11-year-olds, were thrown in juvie as prostitutes, which now, knowing what we know, sounds crazy, but when you're in that place where these kids are, screaming profanities and they're walking down the streets, I guess people thought that that's where they wanted to be. And statistics, for the sake of people understanding just how huge this issue is, I feel that numbers is usually the way to get people to really take note. According to the International Labor Organization, ILO, there are 40 million victims of trafficking in the world and 10 million are children. This is labor and sex trafficking. 600,000 sexually exploited minors every year in the United States. The average age of entry into prostitution in the United States is 12, and that's for girls, and 14 for boys. And 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 6 boys is sexually abused in the United States. Now that is a really, really heartbreakingly large amount of children. But if you think of all the people that you know, whether they be friends or family members, or even just people that you've met along the way, classmates, colleagues, it's not that surprising, is it? Because I think every single one of us knows at least one person who was abused as a child. Indicators of human trafficking. So I did send out a flyer. I don't know if you guys got it. Michelle, I don't know if you disseminated it. It's basically the most common signs of human trafficking. If not, then we can send it after, no problem. For labor trafficking especially, a lot of these are from Department of Homeland Security's their own presentation. So some of these are more geared towards labor trafficking than sex trafficking, but this is a mixture. Lack of access to their own documents, like their passports, etc. This is very common when people are smuggled to the United States and then trafficked. And we'll get to the most common misconception about smuggling versus trafficking later on. But so they don't have access to their passports or any kind of identifying paperwork. There's visible signs of physical violence or abuse, lack of medical attention, signs of torture. That's especially true in cartel cases or cases that involve international crime syndicates or gangs. Locks, fences, restraints, or guards surrounding the building that these people live in. There was a case in Lomita, DHS case, where some random passerby called in this suspected place because he noticed that the barbs were on the inside rather than the outside, and he thought that was suspicious, and that saved like 15 to 20 women who were being labor trafficked in Lomita. It's like not that far away. Unaccompanied minors without guardians, especially in the airport. More and more commonly, flight attendants and basically all the airport staff are learning what it looks like when a youth is being sexually exploited and flown through the airports, right? So a lot of times these pimps will take those girls and fly them somewhere that they don't know. So they are literally at a loss. They don't know where anything is. They're very disoriented. They don't know how to ask for help, and they're being threatened. So more than one occasion, a flight attendant has actually noticed that this is happening and been able to slip a note to them in the bathroom, or even detain them before they get on the aircraft. Commercial sex. So this has become a lot trickier and a lot more difficult. This is definitely one of the parts that is hidden in plain sight because it's culturally accepted. When we talk about OnlyFans or Pornhub or just porn in general, bachelor parties, taking everybody to the strip club, those types of things that they seem like a rite of passage or just a part of our culture. They do hide a lot of exploitation. And I wouldn't even say hide it. Hide is a very strong word for what happens. They veil it, maybe thinly veiled. So a lot of times these individuals who they're mixed in with people who are doing it of their own volition. So it's very difficult to identify one person who's being coerced into it versus another person who's not. Money is involved. So someone else is always taking tips, like this is at specific bars and things like that. The individuals in front of you seem scared. There's a lot of security again in a bar setting. Might have tattoos of the organization or pimp. This is considered branding, especially on the face. You see it a lot on the backs, like the entire back says property of whatever the pimp name is. It's really heartbreaking. You see it on the forehead, on the side of the face, like literally anywhere. And the thing is, if you're not involved in that, you wouldn't necessarily know that that is a brand. And you also wouldn't feel like it's your business to ask someone, right? Like, hey, did somebody brand you and do you need help? These aren't things that we can just do. So it's very difficult to say that this is a black or white issue that with an easy solution. So can't interact with anyone on his or her own. So this is like at a hotel setting or in the airport setting where this individual, the pimp, is constantly answering questions on behalf of the other person. In terms of children showing up to school always exhausted. So I always remind the kids, those classmates that you have in first period that look like they're dead tired every single day consistently. I mean, this looks very different than you played video games. You were up too late playing video games a couple nights a week. And this is like the only kind of exhausted that adults know, like just dead tired, cannot wake up because you're so tired. Showing up to school with expensive items and you can't explain where you got it from, especially in those more at-risk neighborhoods. How did you buy $300 shoes, or how did you come up on that Gucci purse? And that this person's situation, and that there's no possibility of them ever making that amount of money. Sudden changes in behavior, including and probably especially substance abuse and promiscuity. The misnomer is that the promiscuity is only in girls. So it's a lot easier to identify girls now, right? Because we've had TV shows and movies and all kinds of things depicting what girls look like when they're sexually abused and when they're trafficked. But for whatever reason, those same exact markers, when they occur in boys, is more like, that's just culturally what boys are. Boys are going to be boys. But the reality is, if you look into it further, a lot of those things are trauma culture. And the promiscuity in boys, 12-year-old boys talking about sex nonstop in graphic ways that are very inappropriate for their age, they tend to be signs for sexual abuse as well, or inappropriate exposure to sex, which is in its right kind of like a type of abuse. Because if it happened to a girl that way and somebody showed a 12-year-old girl porn, they would immediately be like, wow, that's abusive. And yet if somebody showed a 12-year-old boy porn, it's not necessarily the same reaction across the board, right? Who are the traffickers? So I already mentioned national and international crime networks. We've had cases where drug cartels were involved, and they sell drugs, but they also sell people, because guess what? Drugs are consumables, but eventually you have to make them again. You sell it one time and it's gone. Whereas a human being on average is sold for 7 years, up to 20 people a day for 7 years. And that 7-year expiration date doesn't have so much to do with them escaping as them dying. It's a very dangerous place to be. So medium scale street gangs, again, pretty much anyone who sells contraband. So anyone who sells drugs or weapons also tend to sell human beings because it's much more lucrative. Individual scale, this is the one that's most difficult for law enforcement to prosecute and the most difficult for us to identify in general. Romeo pimps often refer to themselves as boyfriends, and they form such a strong attachment bond with the victim that the victim considers them their boyfriend. And a lot of time you'll hear these stories in which law enforcement did their part. They rescued this girl. This girl will not give up their pimp, right? But if you can imagine, that bond is very, very strong because a lot of times this pimp helped her escape something even worse within her own family. And that's the part that's very difficult to swallow because it's not easy. There's no easy solution. It's like in a perfect world, she would be grateful that she was rescued, be grateful for a chance at another life, be thanking the cops who put their lives at risk to get her out of this difficult situation, and be more than happy to testify against him to save other people from the same fate. But what happens then if he, although he was abusive by normal standards, normal I say, and his love came at the price of her body and her soul, what happens when that's better than what she came from before that? And what happens when psychologically this person has been telling her that she's worthless? This is it's a mixture of domestic violence and other things and exploitation. That bond that she built with this person is, to her, unbreakable. So she's going to protect him until the very, very bitter end. And the scary part here is that there are books, we get to enjoy freedom of speech, yet there are books on Amazon about how to be a pimp and how to psychologically manipulate women into allowing this behavior, not allowing it, embracing it, loving them, being so loyal that they would do anything, including have sex with 20 men in one night to meet a quota because they want to please him. Who are the victims? Well, you know what? Who are the victims? Who do you guys think are, like, when you think of a typical human trafficking victim, what comes to mind? Anybody want to brave?
This is Michelle. I was going to say that I always think of females. I never think of young men.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a very common depiction, right? Especially in movies and that sort of thing.
I think of teenagers.
Yes, definitely very common, especially now. And I think people forget that 17 is still a child, right? Because we've dubbed teenagers as this kind of in-between place where they can kind of look like adults and sometimes have the burdens of some adults, but yet they're still children.
I think of them as always coming from some other country or some other place.
Right, and that's probably the most common before human trafficking started to come to light here. It's like, okay, this is sex tourism in Thailand or the Philippines, right? This happens in Mexico, in third world countries specifically, that where people had less access to anything, equality, the ability to climb up with a decent job, that kind of thing. So it is really scary to realize how prevalent this is happening here in one of the richest, if not the richest, countries in the world. Yes, so we'll take a look a little bit on who the real victims are. And the reality is it's men, women, and children. So if you're thinking also about labor trafficking, working in the fields without pay, a lot of times labor trafficking victims, they get smuggled here, like I said, with the promise of a better life or the chance at a better life. They'll pay somebody, let's say $4,000, which can be a lot for these families, to give them a shot over here. But once they arrive, the person's like, oh, okay, well, it's $4,000 for that. But, to get you here, to house you, to do all these things, your food, it's this much more, let's say $30 a day, and then they only pay them $5 a day or $2 a day. So it's basically in indentured servitude. They'll never be able to make enough to get out. And there's actually a pretty famous case of, is it Alsace Bakery? Something like that. It's a really famous bakery that was in Beverly Hills, owned by a Filipino couple. And I remember this because I'm Filipino, so this was a little bit like shocking to me. They did this to their own people in the Philippines, and basically they legitimately brought them over here and sponsored them and did all of that properly. But once they got here, they paid them much less than what they charged them to live with them. And the good thing is that this actually went to court and they owed them over $1 million in reparations, but that's not the super common outcome, right? So that was a popular bakery in Beverly Hills that they even had a chain in Torrance. But a lot of times these are workers that are in the fields and maybe they don't speak English and can't really get help from other individuals here. They don't know who to ask for help. And because they're, especially if they were brought over and smuggled, so they're illegally here, they are afraid that if they go to law enforcement, that they're just going to get deported, and everything that they worked for and all this sweat, blood, and tears to get to this country will all be for nothing. So they try to survive it as much as they can and send money home as much as they can also. So again, the victims are men, women, and children. In fact, most of our clients who are sexually exploited youth between the ages of 2 and 10 are boys. The rest of them are female, but I would say the majority of the youth that we're seeing are boys. They're diverse in race, class, religion, culture, socioeconomic status, you name it. And they have a lot of things not in common, right? But the one thing, when we distill it to the very, very core of why they're there and what made them vulnerable, it is usually childhood trauma. And it's usually early childhood sexual abuse. So before the age of 6, 7, usually like 2, 3, 4, or 5 years old, they're already being sexually abused. Research suggests that they also develop poor attachment to their early caregivers. So whether that's usually mom, right, traditionally. And the reason for that is that trauma is probably the most contagious thing of all. So mom doesn't know what a good attachment to a caregiver looks like because she didn't get one. And neither did her mom or her mom before her. And so this inability to bond and be a safe place for their child is not natural. It's something that needs to be learned, but you don't know what you don't know, right? So these kids are extremely vulnerable, and that's why intervention therapy is so important. You know, in therapy, we don't just work on talking about the crime. I think the movies are always like, so what do you think about that? Or like, what happened to you? And for us, our approach is always, you know, you have no right to ask somebody what the worst thing that ever happened to them was. What you do have the privilege of doing is to be there and walk with them as they heal. So our therapists are basically taught that they need to build that relationship organically with this person. And so in doing that, they are sort of replacing this early attachment. They're modeling a template for attachment that this person never had before. They become a safe place. They become a reliable person that is always there, that you can say no to and isn't going to beat you up or, you know, fly off the walls. It's somebody who respects you and your boundaries. And so we do this also with the parents, of course, because I'd say 90% of the cases where the child that we're working with is sexually exploited, one or both parents were also sexually abused as children. Whether they disclosed it or not in the past, it's part of our intake paperwork, and almost every single one of them says sexually abused. It's just marked there. So that vulnerability gets passed on, and the treatment is addressing that very need, that need to be a safe place for their kids, someone who can support them, because their kids don't necessarily remember it all. But if they continue to not receive that love, care, and attention, they're going to continue to become vulnerable and perhaps be re-victimized in the future. I see Bob from Long Beach has a question.
Yeah, Francesca, thanks so much for your presentation. My question's into this a little bit into a soft side. One is because you struck me with, we could become alert to the possibility of trafficking when we see it, if we pay attention. But I was listening to NPR yesterday, talking about how people in wealthy countries utilize poor countries to rent uteruses and rent, places to get eggs, so that those who can't have children can utilize some of their genetic material to have. And what they were saying was women in Nepal will donate eggs, and women in India will carry fetuses to term, and then you get your baby. And in this case, there might be 3 or 4 countries involved. It sounds like something that's ripe for trafficking. Is there any way you can distinguish the difference between this? I mean, the pitch yesterday was for $15,000, you can totally alter the life of a woman in India or Nepal. But how do we know that those kinds of processes are actually not trafficking?
You don't. And I mean, they do that here too, right? You can have a, gosh, what is the word for a surrogate? Yeah, surrogate, exactly. You can have a surrogate and that person gets paid a lot of money to do it. And that's the thing, as a Filipino, we have red light districts in the Philippines. And I've had this conversation with my mother, who is our clinical director. So she does know about these things. And yet it took a lot of conversations to really get down to the very core perspective that, when there is no opportunity, is it exploitation, or should you just be grateful that you have a way of making money and putting food on the table for your family, right? And that's a very gray area, I think, that each of us really has to think about, from down to fast fashion, right? Cheap clothing and that kind of thing. When somebody doesn't have an equal opportunity, they're at this crossroads where they say yes or no to an opportunity, to something. And the outcome for yes and no are not equal, then is that a choice or is that exploitation? And like you said, that it's packaged very beautifully, right? Just the same way that we see porn. Pay this girl, she's probably putting herself through college. How many times have you heard that? Like, go to the strip club and give these people their tuition. Like, how many times have we believed that? Because that's a lot more palatable than this girl feels like she has no other choice than to be standing up there naked in front of a bunch of strangers, and she'll take the money that you give her because that's the only money she thinks she can get. That's not as pretty. Or even the more scary thought, she might not be there by choice. Yeah. And even scarier, when you bring it to prostitution in places where prostitution is legal, you might be raping somebody. Like, that's a whole lot less palatable than she's just a college kid, she's smart. Like, there's a lot of these stories where they were college kids and they did put themselves through college through that. But if you look all the way back to the very core of their history, their personal history, there was childhood sexual abuse involved. Because the reality is that there's no 7-year-old kid that goes, I want to be a prostitute when I grow up, or I want to be a stripper when I grow up. That just doesn't happen, right? So what is the difference between a 20-year-old who's broke that thinks, God, I have no other choice but to do this, and a 20-year-old that's broken is like, oh gosh, I guess I'm gonna have to apply at Starbucks and McDonald's, right? And that's usually the difference, is like somebody who has already been taken from them. And the most heartbreaking thing I ever heard was through an organization called Saving Innocence. We work closely with them. They work specifically with sexually exploited youth. And this 15-year-old girl wrote some kind of poem, and I wish I had it. I wish I had it to share with you, but it's really heartbreaking because she was basically saying, this is something that people took from me over and over and over again as a child. And so when I had the opportunity to make money off of it, it wasn't that much of a leap, right? It's like people were using me, but now I got to use myself and make money off of it. I got to buy whatever I wanted. I could rely on myself. I didn't need no man. I didn't need anybody else. Then it's a very fine line between that abuse and exploitation versus sex workers and choice. That's just the reality of it. Again, it's not very clear, and you can't tell the difference. You can't tell the difference when you're on the street and you see, these streets in LA, Figueroa, there's tracks. They're called tracks. They're in Long Beach, PCH, You know, I went to school in Poly. I went to Long Beach, schools in Long Beach my whole life. I went to school in Poly, and I remember, you know, we would callously make fun of these women who walked around looking really messed up, you know, because we knew what they did. We knew they were hoes, as they call themselves. And it's sad because culturally speaking, there was nothing wrong with making fun of them. That just was what it was. And I'm so ashamed to say it, you know, and to think of it that way. But it's so prevalent, and you absolutely can't tell the difference between someone who wants to be there and somebody who's being forced to be there. But I think the core of it is that that really doesn't, in the sense that if somebody is choosing to be there, there's still a lot of underlying unhealed trauma that brought them to that place. And I've spoken with a lot of survivors before, and they're like, well, what's wrong with being able to make your own money and you know, all of this, and then the morality of it, and you know, the feminist movement of being able to do whatever you want with your own body. Well, I said, okay, well, think of the person that you love the most on this earth, whether that's your child or your niece or nephew, or you know, somebody that you're very attached to, that you just unconditionally love. Now, would you want this life for them? And the answer is almost always no. And so a lot of us don't have a very strong moral compass or a strong sense of what's too much for a human soul to bear when it's ourselves, because we're willing to do anything to survive. But when you have to shift that perspective onto somebody that you really love and that you care about and that you would die for, then it becomes very different. And then it becomes more clear, this idea of right versus wrong. I mean, I don't want to call it that because that sounds judgy, but the idea of what is too much of a burden to ask of a human being to survive. So, well, specific examples that would, well, yes.
Oh, I wanted to ask, I know that you're a mom. I actually hopped off the freeway on the 110 going to court with my then 11-year-old in the back seat, and ended up on Figueroa, and right in the middle of that district. At what age do you think the conversation should start regarding these topics? Because it's a very, very difficult conversation to have. It's really hard to explain, and it's better. I had not introduced the topic, so when we ended up on Figueroa, I'm trying to figure out how to sidestep and how to be honest but be age appropriate. You know, are there guidelines that we can use, or something that lets us know when we can start the conversation?
I mean, in reality, the types of conversations to keep them safe start as young as they're verbal, right? So I have a 7-year-old who's about to turn 8 1 week from today, and then a 15-month-old. And my 7-year-old, you know, we've started the body conversations, like who can take her to the bathroom, who can wipe her, what places are not okay to touch. And it's all very, you know, delivered in a very normal way. You know, mommy is okay, I can do this, you know, your grandma is okay, daddy can take you to the bathroom, you know, and these are the 4 safe people who are allowed to take you to the bathroom, and anybody else, you say no. And then as she got older, you know, we live in downtown Long Beach, and there's homelessness everywhere. There's mental illness, substance abuse. And so we started, I remember, I feel for you, Michelle, because it is really, really hard to, on the spot, you know, when your kid asks you a question and you're used to being very honest and vulnerable with them, to say these very scary things you'd love to shelter them from for the rest of their lives. But I remember that there was this homeless lady that was like screaming profanities, and she was like talking, and she was being a little bit scary. So I, you know, grabbed my kid, I put her behind me, but I keep walking. I also grew up in Long Beach, so it's not a lot that can scare me. And then she asks me later on, she's like, why was that lady talking to herself? And so I was like, oh man, this is a loaded question. You're 5. What can I tell you about drugs that's relatable? And then we're like, okay, poison apple, you know, poison in general, just poison. Like people put these things in their bodies, and at the time it feels good. They don't realize this is what they look like in real life. There's like a whole world that's happening in here that isn't happening out there. And just kind of gradually relating it to the Disney movies or whatever TV shows. Sadly, Disney has a lot of very easily relatable topics. It's a bit dark. So we talk about villains and like how bad things happen to these people for them to become the way they are. Nobody's born good or bad. And this person who's making these decisions doesn't necessarily think that they're negatively affecting other people, or sometimes they don't have the capacity to really care about it because they're so hurt. All of these things. We're talking about Scar from The Lion King. We're talking about, again, Snow White and the Poison Apple. And then sex trafficking, though, that is a very difficult thing. I mean, I think at this age, at 7, I have mentioned to her that sometimes, kids are hurt. I don't know that she understands sexually yet, but I think around 9, 10, 11, it starts to become an easier conversation in that, they're starting to be introduced to things like that. Consent, right? So kissing, we've talked about in some of these Disney movies where they'll kiss briefly at the end, and I'm like, you see how he asked her permission first? Like, you have, like, that's normal, like you're supposed to do that. And so later on, it sets you up for that person did not ask their permission, and it's as simple as that, right? Exploitation is really like you don't have this person's consent and you're doing it anyways, and this person is making money off of that person's lack of consent. So that, I mean, that's so hard. I'm sorry. And I wish there was a guideline. And actually, I've been asked this question quite a few times, so maybe we'll make one, a way to appropriately introduce this idea. And the reality is we don't have to scare our kids for them to be safe. We just have to give them the perfect boundaries and guidelines to understand when things are not safe. We have to show them what safe is, right? So if anything doesn't feel like that, it doesn't feel good, and they know that it doesn't feel good, and they know you're a safe person to tell that it doesn't feel good. That's probably the best gift that we can give our kids. It's not being like, oh, look at that, someone could steal you. Like, that's not a good thing. I think as an Asian American, that was a very common thing. Like, oh, you better hold my hand because someone's going to snatch you up. Yeah, I don't see that being super useful. At least not when they're really young. Of course, if it's a very dangerous situation, there are a lot of people and you need your kid to really understand, then scare tactic is useful. So, and then I think kind of with that, for this part of the presentation, who the victims are, being able to identify that a youth that's running away is not usually running away because they want bad things to happen to them. They're running away from something, right? And that shift in idea, and you'll notice it because maybe your kids or grandkids or nieces and nephews have these friends who are labeled as troublemakers that you don't particularly want your kid to be friends with, right? But knowing these markers, it's like, oh wow, this kid is constantly running away and getting in trouble and crying out for help and is super promiscuous for a 12-year-old or 11-year-old. Then you kind of connect the dots and you're like, hey, this is a very high risk situation that this person is being sexually abused at home or being abused at all at home. The harder part is what to do with that information, right? Because the reality is that taking them away from their parents, calling CPS, is not necessarily a better choice. We understand what the rates are in the foster care system for someone to get abused, and it's not an easy fix. But potentially being the mentor of this kid, being their attachment figure, being the person who shows them what safety and boundaries looks like, that could be life-changing. Whether that's inviting this kid over for dinner, and it's a scary risk. And would you be, the hard questions to ask are, is this a risk to your own child, a risk to your own family? Because hurt people, that's a real thing. So there's a lot of things to consider, but being a mentor to these kids, especially if you're working or or retired and you have the time to volunteer to mentorship programs, like that is a huge thing that will definitely change the world. The impacts of that are multi-generational. So youth with history of physical or sexual abuse, again, like any kind of abuse, they basically already have a target on their back that says that they're used to this, that uncomfortable situations don't make them feel uncomfortable. They don't have a sixth sense or a spidey sense for when things are bad because they're so used to it. So those kids are not going to cry or scream if they get kidnapped, or they're not going to fight as hard if they become thrust out into the middle of the street. They're just going to survive. Immigrants and refugees, again, same thing, trauma. Men, women, and children involved in the sex industry. So, we're talking about how most of the time when we picture a woman or a girl being abused, but what if I tell you, and you probably already know this, but in a very separate thought, that all abusers were once abused. So all pedophiles were once sexually abused children. It's true. You know that. And then now what if I tell you, and you already know this too, that most abusers or buyers of sex or porn or child sex are male. So then what do you do with that information? Then you realize that the scope of men and boys being sexually abused is much, much bigger than we first think of it. They just become perpetrators rather than victims. And for victims, that's the crossroads. Those are the two most common roads that get traveled, right? On the one hand, you continue being victimized because that's just what you're used to. And on the other hand, you get tired of it. And so you victimize other people. It's like bullying, right? Everyone who's ever been bullied was once bullied themselves. Or rather, yeah, everyone that is a bully was once bullied themselves. And when I had one of these classes with middle school kids, I asked them for instances of bullying that they've heard of, whether they was a classmate or somebody that they knew. And one of them raised their hand and said domestic violence. And I was like, wow, I have never thought of it that way. I mean, we know what they look like, what bullying is and what domestic violence is, but I never connected them that it's literally one person bullying the other. That is exactly what that is. And so it's that same propensity, and that father, whoever, or mother who is, the perpetrator in that case, we know that 99% of the time they came from a household that also had domestic violence. So again, it's the bullying cycle, right? So it's this victim can either become a perpetrator or victim, or secret option 3, healing. And that is a much more difficult option to undertake because they're literally doing something that they've never seen before. They're trying to walk a path that they have they're stumbling into a place that no one's ever shown them or told them was even a possibility. Most of the time, these people who have this trauma, these kids who carry this trauma, they inherited it from hundreds of years worth of generations, if you really look back. And so being the one person, the first person to turn around and say, okay, I want something different. I don't know what that looks like, but it's not this. Takes a lot of guts and a lot of courage. And in fact, one of the survivors that we interact with the most on Instagram, she has a lot of very insightful thoughts to our posts. And one of the things that she said that really stuck with me was healing was so much harder than just continuing to be abused, because she was one of the common cases of being sexually abused as a child by her own uncle, actually. And this is here in LA. And she lives in Long Beach. So, this is part of the track that she ran before. And she was saying that was normal for her, getting trafficked by her. I think it was her uncle or her cousin, but he wasn't that old. He wasn't that much older than her. He started trafficking her when she was 11. And I think this person was 16. They were young. And so she said, starting therapy and looking like into this mirror of a person I didn't like was painful, and it's not easy. And that's true. Our clients go through hell and back to get to the place where they're just stable, to get to a place where they have hope again and can say no to anything without feeling like they're going to, the other shoe's going to drop soon. So with that said, I'm just going to really quickly go through these mental health issues. This is the goal of this part, is to really instill a sense of empathy, because a lot of times when we look at survivors of trauma or abuse, we're looking at the 40-year-old lady in Starbucks who's screaming and smells bad and nobody wants to help her, But if you take that same individual, but you rewind time back 10 years, and this person is, let's say 15 years, 25 years old, stripping or on OnlyFans, which is like a porn, like a homemade porn website. And you kind of look at her and you're like, well, you're an adult, but you're still pretty. You're making poor choices, right? That's what That's what most of society would say. It's like, oh, you're grown, so you're grown enough to make these choices, but you're making bad ones. And then go back 10 more years from that, but they're 15. And now they're the kid that's running away, dressing like really promiscuously and inappropriately, is the kid that we don't want our kids to hang out with, right? And it's still like, that's her choice, or where are her parents at, you know? It's still kind of her fault though, because at 15, you know, there's volition, and then these are the kids that look very, very mature. So they don't act like children. They're cursing and angry, and you don't necessarily want to stop what you're doing. And, you know, maybe you're already busy with your own parenting and look at that kid and try to help them. But if you rewind 10 more years back, and this is a 5-year-old, then I think we can all agree that that 5-year-old did not deserve what happened to them, and they did not choose what happened to them. So we have to remember too that these cute little kids who deserve our love and protection, they grow up. And we can't forget them just because they grew up. Excuse me, sorry. I'm gonna I got a little bit of a tickle in my throat. I'm sorry. So when we talk about PTSD, like that's such a thrown around term these days. And this particular slide I actually made for service providers, because we do a lot of trainings for caseworkers and social workers and stuff like that, and other therapists as well. And you know, for me, the goal for those trainings is always to spark that empathy and compassion again, to start seeing that other person as a human being who's worthy of a better life. Because a lot of times if they're assigned 40 clients in a week, it just becomes very difficult not to lump them all together and lose that compassion and that original reason why they went into the helping field, right? So when we talk about PTSD, anxiety, depression, those are the 3 most common diagnoses for this population. What does that actually mean, right? Like when that person sits in front of you, like what is the burden that they're carrying every second of every day? We don't realize that that usually means that they don't sleep. And I don't know about you, but if I don't sleep well 2 nights in a row, I am not the same person as I am when I get a good night's sleep. And this person in front of you hasn't slept for 10 years or more, because by the time they're 20, they've been having recurring nightmares for 15 years. So they don't even know what good sleep looks like for a lot of them. And or they've been medicated since they were 6, 7, 8 years old, because for depression, for anxiety, and other things. Because physically, if you don't sleep and you're on high alert, right? You have anxiety, so your fight or flight response, your adrenaline is always running. Bad things are going to happen to your gut, to your body. Biologically, things are getting worn down, and you have to take medicine for that. A lot of survivors that we work with have intestinal issues, gastrointestinal issues, because if you notice, when you don't feel good, usually it's a gut feeling. That's real and it's biological. So they're dealing with all these things, taking medications for more than one of them. The medications are also interacting in a way that nobody can predict, because it's different from person to person. And so literally, if this has been happening since they were children, they don't actually know what normal looks like. They don't know who they are if they didn't have all these things. And they might not be the same person, you know? Social implications would be like, it's difficult to trust other people. And we all know that when we're trying to get out of a very difficult place, having support is super important. But if you have trust issues, then how do you let somebody close enough to share some of that burden with them? So they're literally alone. And all of these disadvantages basically are what contribute to somebody being victimized and vulnerable over and over again. You know, if you're a predator, you're not going to pick the strongest person in the pack to pick off. That wouldn't be smart. And so in treatment, in therapy, these are the things that we try to address and build on, you know, like how to build relationships with people, how to be a good parent, how to have friends again. And through that relationship with their therapist, they're learning how to trust another human being, even if it's tentatively at first. They're learning that people are not all bad, and not everybody wants to get something out of you, right? So in any case, just so you know, like when you see somebody who is a victim, there's so much under that. It's like an iceberg, right? You just see the very top, and all these layers under are what contributed to this place that they're in right now. And us having the humility to understand and empathize with the idea that if we were dealt the same exact cards in life, we would be them. There's not really that much choice, because the choice is, again, the yes and no, or, you know, doing this or not doing this. They don't have equal outcomes. You know, having, whether it's because you want to provide for your family, or because you actually were coerced and just kidnapped into doing it, in which case there was no choice, zero choice. It always falls back onto the same core broken thing, which is that trauma. And the core thing that's broken is the attachment to somebody. Understanding what love is. Everybody has their own definition, and that's what makes it very difficult. But you know, when somebody tells you that they love you but they're hurting you, that's kind of your template, and it's very, very difficult to get out of that. So what can you do? Be compassionate and empathetic. We talked about this. Pay attention to all the kids in your family, their friends. Like, just pay attention to the children. A lot of times we don't think twice about them. Somebody hits their wife in the grocery store, you're gonna call 911. Somebody smacks their kid upside the head at the grocery store, or hits the kid with just as much force as they hit the wife. That's their business, because that's their kid, right? We don't treat children the same way as we do adults yet, but that's their formative years. That's when they need the most protection. And so what we're doing as a culture, as a society, is catching it after. Okay, we have all these rehab places, we have halfway houses, we have, you know, all these programs for youth afterwards, for at-risk youth. But what if we could go further back and create parents that don't raise at-risk youth, right? And a lot of that comes from this, from mentorship from other people, from people stopping their perfect lives long enough to look over and say, hey, you need a hand? You know, and you guys are probably, I'm preaching to the choir at this point, because I'm sure that you're here because that is exactly what you care about. But that is also contagious, right? So being that person for somebody else will encourage them to be that for many other people. Getting involved in local organizations that help youth, survivors, and victims. And I know I didn't leave very much time, but does anyone have any questions?
Can you click your screen so we can, or your share?
Yes. Yeah. And the flyer that I sent out, or that Michelle can send out, has the number to report to safely. So you would never want to interrupt in the middle of, or get in the middle of a potential trafficking situation, because it could be more dangerous for you and for the victim that you're trying to help. You know, it makes people much more volatile. So, but if you guys have any questions, and they might come out later, or maybe you don't want to ask them in front of everybody, you can always email, and you can email me directly. So it's Francesca@humansave.org.
It looks like there's a hand up.
Oh, yes.
So I have a question about the, because I've heard some conversation, as you're probably aware, like there's like this conversation with OnlyFans right now, and the banks are saying that they're not going to allow credit card transactions anymore. And so basically OnlyFans is going to go away. Right. But one of the arguments that I've heard about this, about the negative aspect of the banks not allowing credit card transactions, now a paper trail goes away as well, and following up on things. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Exactly that. Like, it's never that simple, right? Because now those might be in-person meetings, right? Because it's not going to remove the need for this person to make money that way. All it does is it removes it from being super easy to access, which in theory, which I'm sure this is the theory that they had, was that it was going to prevent people from wanting to do it. But the reality is that it's not. And you're exactly right. And that those are the things that aren't, you know, black and white. Everything in this, and exploitation in general, operates in a very gray place. on the one hand, you want to applaud the credit card companies for even deciding to do this, because obviously they're supposed to lose revenue from it. And that's standing in solidarity against human trafficking, against exploitation and sexual abuse, that's child sexual abuse. But on the other hand, that's not the cause, right? So we're just treating all the symptoms, and if we don't get to the cause of it, it doesn't change much. In fact, it could potentially make it more dangerous. So it's kind of like what happened with Backpage, right? Backpage, you guys aware of Backpage? It was kind of like Craigslist, but very dark and specifically for sex. Like a lot of people would put up girls for sex on Backpage, like Craigslist ads. And the thing is, they couldn't identify whether they were underage or not. A 17-year-old could look 25 with enough makeup on. A 12-year-old could look old enough, you know, depending on how you dressed her and put makeup on her too. So that was one of the things that they eradicated years ago. And literally my first thought was, that's just going to make it harder to find them now. It's not even necessarily going to end it, because it didn't. Obviously, OnlyFans popped up after that. So, I mean, whether it was a response to it or it was just like now there's an open space for it, or whether it's completely unrelated, that's just, Sebastian, that is like the greatest part, the hardest thing to tackle is like, in meaning to do good, you know, we have to really look at the implications of what we're doing and think about the victims, the potential victims, and whether we're addressing the root cause of whether we're solving any problems or whether we're just creating new ones. So
yeah, thank you, because that's kind of like where my brain was, because now the conversation is the next OnlyFans site that's going to come up is probably not going to have anything to do with credit transactions. It's going to go to cryptocurrency, and that's going to be the new format where there is no paper trail, and just going to make it darker.
Exactly. And I don't know if you guys have heard of the dark web, but that is exactly what's happening there right now already. It's like, instead of Safari or Internet Explorer or whatever, you download these specific things that are completely untrackable and you pay with Bitcoin. And the worst cases that we've ever had have been through there. And their children, and the abuse is unimaginable. So, but I do want to leave you with a good thought and some hope. And I will say that, you know, we're so lucky at Humansave to do what we do because we get to see the hope, the healing. You know, a lot of these other organizations, they only work with the clients when they're at their very worst. And then when they get better, they leave and they have no idea what happens to them. So for us, I think it's the biggest gift that, you know, we've had clients since 2018 or 2017 when we first started, and we still have them now, and we can see the change, you know, the hope. You know, these kids, oftentimes because they're kids, they don't understand what happened to them. And so their resilience is so amazing and so profound and inspiring. So we just try to give them the tools for if anything comes up later on, you know, and also the tools to set very strong, firm boundaries, which is what they were lacking because of what their parents were lacking, I should say, and they're lacking by default. So as they grow up, you know, they're very strong and protected, but to see them thrive, to have dreams and goals of becoming a fashion designer, or being a firefighter, and their resilience is just, it's a gift, and it's amazing, and it's not too late. You know, one of our board members is a survivor of human trafficking too, and you would never know it because the amount of work that she poured into her healing, it spanned decades, and she still does a lot of work now. But nobody who knows her or, you know, works with her would ever even suspect it, because that's the scope of healing that she's been able to accomplish. So I will say that even when somebody's 35, 45, and they're in need of help, they still deserve it, and they're still worthy of it, because they still have, what, 50, 40 years to contribute to this earth. You know, in the grand scheme of life, we think that, I don't know, some people think that they don't have a good relationship with their kid at 16 and it's too late. But, you know, these we all grow up into 70s, 80s, 90s, 100. I mean, some people are 100. I know people who are centennials. And so there's so much more left to give in life. And like with anything else that brings meaning, it's connection, right? So healing is through connections. If you can connect to somebody who needs it and really feel for them, empathize with them, be there, that is probably the most profound thing you could possibly do. And that's the prevention. You know, Sebastian, we do that with more people on this earth We're going to raise boys who don't believe in buying girls for sex or boys for sex. You know, as we heal people, we are also preventing them from becoming perpetrators. And that's the thing that I tell people about our awareness and prevention program. We work with the at-risk population. You know, everyone assumes that prevention is to prevent them from becoming victims, but healing and prevention also prevents them from becoming the next set of perpetrators. So with that said, thank you so much for your time, guys. And then really, if you have any questions or thoughts, even anything that you've heard that you want to kind of talk about or discuss, please feel free to email me. I'd be more than happy to have that discussion with you guys.
Perfect. And we put all her email and the link and all that stuff in the chat. So it'll be there for
thank you.
future folks as well that might watch this later. Thank you so very much. Michelle, want to close this out? Yeah.
Francesca, thank you so much. I've really learned a lot. I'm sure that most people on this has really learned a lot. It's a very difficult topic, and I think that you handle it with a lot of grace and with a lot of compassion. And I think the thing that comes through most in how you present is that there's a lot of empathy, and that really translates. So thank you so much for spending time with us today on this topic. And I will get the flyer out. I'll have to recheck my emails to make sure that I have it, but I'll make sure I get it out. Yeah.
I'll just resend it. No problem.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
guys.
everyone.
Have a wonderful rest of your week ahead. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Happy birthday to your daughter.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.